questions? No questions? Okay. So for those of you who are kind of curious, about what a timing diagram looks like, you can just type up, timing diagram, memory read cycle, okay, and then go to images. That would be the easiest way to do it. And right here we have 8085 memory cycle, and we'll go ahead and take a quick look. I just want to point out one thing.
It's really bad resolution.
Sorry?
The first one's a bad resolution.
Is it?
Google Images was broken for me earlier.
It's got this new thing that I've never seen before.
What
What's going on right now is that blackness.
Yeah, it's just hanging up.
that tooltip looking
Yeah.
thing?
I've never seen that before.
They make it too interactive. I don't like it.
They're trying to cater to the touchscreen crowd.
Yep.
Oh, is that it?
Yep, they just need to make up their mind.
I think it's really hard to make a single interface that works well with both touch-based and also mouse-driven
Tell that to Windows.
interface. Yeah, to Microsoft, Google, I thought Google was smarter not to follow suit, doing that sort of thing. I just like everything CLI, man, command line interface. I just need a keyboard, no stinking mouse.
Well, most of the world still uses a mouse. Why do they even try to cater to touch? Okay.
All right, so we're,
Blame Apple for
let's
that.
see, where,
Blame Apple for everything.
okay, so we're done with memory cycles, and here's a little bit of a discussion of cache, okay? Cache is a special kind of memory. It's kind of called associative memory, because it is kind of like a map, okay? A cache is associative memory associating a physical address to its content. Okay, this is how it works. When the processor needs to access a particular memory location, it will transparently inquire the cache first. Okay, so between me, the processor, and the memory chips, now we have something called a cache sitting in between. What the cache does is you can look at it as another person. Okay, so let's say you are the cache, mechanism between the processor and the memory. So when I'm ready to access or to inquire, all the memory chips, I will, specify the locations, and then, I will, say, okay, who has it, right? Or what is the content? So your job is to intercept that operation, and then you say, oh, guess what? We don't have to go that far. We don't have to go to the memory chips because you just accessed that particular location 3 cycles ago, and it was a write cycle, and this time you're reading the same location back, and I have it in my notebook here. That is the value of that particular location. So you are helping me to short circuit the entire operation, so I don't have to go to memory. So what happens is the MMU is the one that has to be cache aware, not the instructions. When you write instructions in assembly, you cannot say, okay, this instruction will use the cache, this one instruction won't use the cache. It is not up to the instructions to control it. It is up to the MMU, the memory management unit, to do that. And it occurs even before the translation from logical location to physical location. Okay. How much cache does your processor have?
3.
Well, you got 16 gigs of RAM, so how much cache do you have?
2 megs probably.
2 megs, 4 megs, something like that, right? Okay, so let's figure this out. What is the proportion of 4 megabytes out of 16 gigabytes?
434. Really small.
It's 1/4 of a thousandth, right? Approximately. Okay, tiny little proportion out of the whole thing. So why is that? Why don't we have at least a whole gig of cache? Yep.
Because cache is extremely expensive and there's not that much room next to the processor.
Exactly. In order for cache to be quick, it has to be close to the processor core. But there's only so much real estate around the processor core, both from the perspective of routing. Remember, we need to make sure that everything can be routed back to the core, and also from the perspective of your silicon real estate, how much area it will take up. Okay, So that's why we don't have that much cache. And we have different levels of cache too. This may be outdated already.
There's
Level
L3.
1 cache is closest to the processor. It can actually keep up with the speed of the ALU. But because of the locality, you can only have so much level 1 cache. Level 2 cache is one step further from the processor on the die. Okay, it is still on the same die, physically on the same chip. But because of that, because it's further away, you can actually have a little bit more level 2 cache than level 1 cache. But due to the longer physical distance because even though it's on the same die, but it's actually further away, level 2 cache may or may not be able to keep up with the raw speed of a processor. Level 3 cache is usually shared by different cores of a multi-core design. So if you have a quad-core design, depending on the manufacturer and also depending on the chip, they can make caches specific to each core, but most of the time they're shared. Okay, does that make sense? Because a lot of times, it doesn't matter which core is executing an instruction, as long as somebody is taking care of it, it's okay. So that means you don't want the cores to have separate caches, because if they have separate caches, it means only this processor can execute that instruction really quickly. The next one, who is free and got nothing else to do, cannot do it quickly. So that's why we have shared cache in a multi-core design. Level 3 cache for sure cannot keep up with the processor's raw speed, but it is still a whole lot faster than accessing memory, because you don't have to go through the entire cycle and all the latency associated with reading from memory or writing to memory. Are there any questions about caching? Yep.
I don't know, maybe I'm behind, but I'm aware of like these units that are separate caches. They're like an add-on to your cache. I'm not sure.
Are you talking about a disk controller cache, or are you talking about a processor board that's motherboard cache?
And it's not motherboard cache, it's a separate unit.
Okay, so you're talking about probably a disk controller, like a SATA controller or a RAID type of a controller.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, those are separate, because they're caching content on the hard drive. It's pretty easy to beat, the access speed to a physical hard drive. Because on the physical hard drive, you have two mechanical latencies. One mechanical latency has to do with the seeking, the movement of the disk head. That's usually measured in 7 or 8 milliseconds on the average. And then you have the rotational latency, because the disk head may not be over the sector that you want to access. Okay, so if it just miss it, then you have an entire rotation on the disk to come back to the sector that you want to read. So those physical latencies are very, very long compared to the memory cycles that we just talked about. By, I don't know, we're talking about milliseconds versus at the most a fraction of a microsecond. So we are off by easily 10,000 times or more. So that makes sense. So it still makes sense to have memory, just regular memory on a disk controller for caching. Because without that cache, without regular memory, which has all those latencies and whatnot that we talked about, without that, you're talking about millisecond of latency. With that, you're only talking about hundreds of nanoseconds of latency. So we are still off by a whole lot. It pays to have cache in that case, even though it's external. Okay, good question.
So if your processor's looking for data, it would look at level 1 cache and level 2 cache and level 3.
Right, but that's automatic. Your instruction cannot control. Well, to a certain extent, yes, but most of the time, after the initialization of your operating system, for the most part, your instructions do not, have any control over caching. Any other questions? So when Intel says, our, i7 processor has, 6 megabytes of cache, which type of cache do you think they are talking about?
Level 3.
Level 3. All right. Next slide talks about burst mode memory access, and this only applies to SDRAM, or synchronous dynamic random access memory. I don't know who comes up with all these names, acronyms, abbreviations. Now this one is interesting because it ties in DDR technology, double rate Is it, what is DDR?
Double data rate.
Double data rate. Okay, I missed the middle D. Double data rate, which is now not really double anymore, but they still refer to it as DDR. So it ties in the DDR technology with caching. Okay. Okay, let's kind of, let me switch back to the memory cycle part here. Okay, so we go back to memory cycle. Okay, this is the entire full cycle. This part here takes time, okay, because you have, you know, a lot of address lines. In the example, we only have 9 address lines, but these days, you know, how many lines do we have to a single memory module? A lot. I'll just call it a lot. Okay. So to specify, you know, to latch the address and make the voltage stabilize takes a bit of time. Okay. There's a physical latency that we cannot overcome in physics. This part here can be specified just once, but you know it has its own latency too, and these two can easily overlap, you know, without any problems. And then you have this part here. Okay, let me highlight what I'm talking about. Okay, this part here also has its own latency. This is internal to the chip itself, but there's a latency associated with this part, which is, you know, reading or sampling the address line, and then internally on the memory chip, you know, internally, you know, control the pathway between the data line pins on the chip to the internal location where we are supposed to store that byte. So there's a latency here as well. All this latency can be somewhat avoided if we say, oh, you know what, we have, you know, a different type of memory cycle. I'm not going to say the entire address. I'm just going to say the next location of the previous operation. Okay? So instead of giving you the entire address, instead of telling you, you know, I want to access, you know, page 766, and this is the write cycle, this is the data byte that I want you to write to that location, I'm just saying the next page. Okay? Now think about it just physically. If I give you a phone book, okay, and you have to close it every single time before I ask you to flip to a certain page, how much time would it take to flip to an arbitrary page? It takes a little bit of time, right? You know, because you open it up and then you get to the approximate location, and then you have to, you know, flip a few more pages to get to the exact location that I tell you, right? Let's say you have the phone book open already in front of you, okay? And I just tell you the next page. How much time would that take? Considerably less. And that's DDR technology, okay? It's really just saying the next page, the next page, the next page, the next page. So the latency in order to access the next byte becomes a lot shorter because it's not a full cycle anymore. The internal latency to the chip is a whole lot smaller because we are just incrementing an address that is internal to the memory chip. And waiting for that to stabilize is a whole lot shorter than having to latch out the entire address on the bus itself, because the bus has a long copper wires. Okay? And as a result, you know, we will be able to pump data much quicker to a memory chip if we just say the next page, the next page, the next page, the next page. That's called burst mode access. So if I go back to the notes that we were just talking about, right here. So that's basically what I mean by burst mode access, which basically means, you know, if I want to write something, I'm not going to write 1 byte at a time. I'm going to write 32 bytes at a time. The first byte